We're so glad to see so many of you here. A nice full room. It's just the way we like it, so that's great. Welcome and good morning. I'm Demetra Nightingale. I know many of you here, and I'm an Institute Fellow here at the Urban Institute. I want to thank all of you for joining us today for the conversation on how agencies use learning agendas and other evidence-building approaches, evaluation plans to inform agency decisions and guide research and evaluation activities. I encourage everyone in the audience here to continue today's dialogue by sharing your thoughts or observations on social media, and you can use the hashtag #LiveAtUrban, which probably is on one of the screens here. And please include the speakers' Twitter handles also, which are on the agenda that you all should have. I also want to welcome today our virtual audience. We have many people joining us over the webcast live stream. And if you're tuning in online on the webcast, please submit any questions that you have throughout the event to events@urban.org anytime during the program. Someone will filter those, read them, and then bring them up to the moderator. So we want you to participate as much as those in the room. At the Urban Institute, we strongly believe that data, facts, and evidence matter. We do research, and the analysis and evidence helps us to understand the country's most complex social and economic problems. Our goal is to use analysis and evidence to elevate the debate about important policy issues. The federal leaders that are speaking today know firsthand the intricacies and nuances of evidence building, strategies within their agencies, and we have a range of agencies represented today, and they understand how critical it is that that work can ensure that government programs effectively serve Americans. The discussion today will focus on ways that agencies are building the culture of evidence and learning and promoting evidence through using things like agency learning agendas, evaluation plans, linking administrative data, performance analysis, and performance management strategies. So the discussion is wide-ranging, and it is really representing sort of different ways different agencies approach evidence building. Understanding how research activities are planned and prioritized is crucial for well-informed policymaking, and the learning agendas are a key tool, one tool, for organizing and sharing the plans and the results. So today we're aimed at increasing public knowledge and understanding of learning agendas and planning for evaluations. Our panels are going to discuss different agency approaches to developing and implementing learning agendas, as well as the importance of stakeholder engagement and partnering with program offices and evaluation offices. Research being done here at the Urban Institute, and some new research that's just being released, including a paper by Will Shipman and Keith Fudge, who are in here today, provides a guide for federal agencies to understand the range of approaches that different agencies are taking to engaging stakeholders in developing learning agendas. And a new report just released this week, maybe yesterday, by Molly Scott and Will Oliver, provides a useful guide for evaluation office leaders and government officials about key elements and staff capacities that evaluation offices need. We have hard copies of both of those reports, I think, outside, and they're also available online. We have a great panel that will dive into the topic today with leaders from the Small Business Administration, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and HHS's Administration for Children and Families. And we're also very fortunate to be joined by the Deputy Secretary of HUD, who will kick off the conversation in just a minute. This event is funded by the Laura and John Arnold Foundation as part of the Evidence-Based Policy Making Collaborative. And the event today is sponsored in collaboration with our great partners, the Bipartisan Policy Center and Results for America. So we're grateful for the Arnold Foundation's support and their commitment to evidence-based policymaking and building capacity, and to our co-host sponsors today. We hope that this event will help agency staff that are considering developing learning agendas or improving their evaluation planning, and we hope it will help to understand the range of approaches, not one single approach, that can build a process that works for them. I also want to make sure that you know that on the Urban Institute website, we now have an evidence-based capacity building page. So if you go to urban.org, pull down policy centers, and there you will see evidence-based capacity page, which is under cross-center initiatives. So we hope you will look at those sites and look at some of our reports and give us feedback. Our moderators today are Erica Podig and Nick Hart. And Erica is Urban Institute's Chief Innovation Officer and Vice President of our Research to Action Lab. And Nick is the Director of the Bipartisan Policy Center's Evidence-Based Policy Initiative. So with that, first I'm going to turn it over to Diana Epstein for introductory remarks. And Diana is the evidence team lead at the White House OMB, Office of Management and Budget, OMB. And the evidence team collaborates with other OMB offices, as many of you know, on setting the evidence-building priorities and selecting appropriate evaluation methodologies, using findings from evaluations and other studies in program design and decision-making, and developing agency capacity to build and use evidence. The evidence team also provides expert advice and technical assistance on evidence-related activities and initiatives for a broad range of federal agencies and functions. So Diana, thank you so much for joining us.
All right. Hi, everyone. Great crowd. Thanks, first of all, to the Urban team for having us here today. It's great to be here. So bringing evidence to bear in decision-making is a critical component of good government. And OMB continues to seek ways for agencies to adopt stronger practices to generate more evidence about what works and then what needs improvement. This is really important in order to inform mission-critical decisions and policies. We think that agencies should be integrating evidence and rigorous evaluation findings into all kinds of decisions. So that's budget, programmatic, management, policy decisions. But doing this isn't easy. It requires an infrastructure and it requires a real commitment to credibly build and use evidence. And it also really requires a culture of learning and continuous improvement. So in June, as part of the plan to reorganize the federal government, OMB had a proposal to strengthen federal evaluation. And in case you missed it, it was at the very, very end, page 118. So if you haven't seen it, I encourage you to check it out. But one key component of the proposal was asking agencies to establish and utilize multi-year learning agendas. So this is an idea that many people have been talking about for a number of years, both outside and inside the government. We've been sort of lightly socializing it with the agencies that we work with, as well as through the evidence analytical perspectives chapters of the last few presidents' budgets. Why learning agendas? So we think that learning agendas are a very promising tool for building and using evidence for a variety of reasons. First of all, at their core, learning agendas promote good government principles because they help agencies fulfill their missions in the most effective and efficient ways. Implementing a learning agenda process will allow agencies to strategically plan their evidence-building activities. So this includes, identifying and making progress on those short-term questions while also sort of working toward longer-term questions and longer-term goals. So a good learning agenda includes both. Implementing and updating a learning agenda builds and maintains this culture of evidence that I was talking about a minute ago. And it's, a culture of evidence, it's a culture of learning. And that allows agencies to start to really think critically about the programs and the processes and the policies that they're responsible for. And finally, when used effectively, the learning agenda process is well integrated into other agency functions. So it should be complementing what agencies are already doing and a key part of how an agency does business, not an add-on that's kind of happening on the side. We also appreciate that there's no one-size-fits-all approach, as Demetra was saying. So learning agendas, they should be iterative, flexible, transparent, and most importantly, tailored to meet an individual agency's needs. As well as, priorities change, context change. So the learning agenda needs to change and adapt to match. So we understand, no single approach or format's going to work for every agency, nor should it. There are certainly strategies and practices that are, common to successful learning agenda approaches, but to be meaningful, this has to match what an agency needs. And I think that's really important to emphasize. There should be a meaningful activity. It's not a compliance exercise. It's not a check the box thing that you just say, oh, we've done it, now let's move on. This needs to be meaningful for all the stakeholders in an agency. And I'm excited that we have a variety of approaches happening right now, and a number of them are represented here today that we're going to hear from. We also recognize that agencies right now are at really different places when it comes to learning agendas. So we have a few agencies that are leaders that have been doing this well for a number of years. We can hold them up as great examples. We also have a number of agencies that are maybe starting down this road. They think it's a good idea. They're sort of curious and would like to go forward, but they're not sure how. And then, quite frankly, we have a set of agencies that have no idea what we're talking about and don't really see why this would be helpful for them. So, there's a wide range, and, we recognize that. But that's one of the things that we're hoping to do with this reorg proposal, and by emphasizing learning agendas is sort of, help everyone across the government start to implement this tool. So I'll end by just reiterating that we really do need to continue building capacity throughout the federal government to better build and use evidence. And we think that learning agendas are a great tool to help agencies start down this path. So thanks very much, and I'll turn it over to the next panel.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Diana. That was great to have that kind of context. And I think now we're going to turn it over to Erica Podig.
Oh, coming right now. They're about to watch.
They're on their way. And Erica is going to moderate the first session discussion with Deputy Secretary Patnow. And I think that some of the activities that have been developed at HUD and are continuing will provide us with a great understanding of sort of from the highest level in a cabinet department how evidence is viewed and how it can help to promote the accumulation of evidence that can meet the priority needs of a particular administration and department. So I will turn it over now to Erica, and she will moderate this first session. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much.
Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning to everyone in the room and on the webcast. So excited to be here with you today. I have the distinct pleasure to introduce the Honorable Pamela Hughes Patnow, who's Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Deputy Secretary Patnow has 30 years of experience that really ranges from housing and community development, real estate, economic development. And prior to joining HUD in her current capacity, she was the president of the Ronald J. Terwilliger Family Foundation, which is a national nonprofit focused on the education and elevating the affordable housing crisis. Before co-founding the Terwilliger Foundation, Deputy Secretary Patnow had senior leadership roles at the Bipartisan Policy Center and the Urban Land Institute. But earlier in her career, Deputy Secretary Patnow served as the Assistant Secretary for the Community Planning and Development part of HUD, where she administered more than $8 billion in housing and community development funds. She played a significant role in the department's efforts to rebuild the Gulf Coast region following the hurricanes Katrina and Rita, providing direct oversight of $17 billion in disaster recovery funds. And her leadership in disaster recovery really continues to today. So this is my formal introduction, but I've had the pleasure of working with Pam. She's given me permission to call her by her first name. Because we've been able to work together in many different of the capacities, and I can speak firsthand to her commitment to research and really using evidence to elevate debate and to advance policy. So I'm excited to have this conversation with you today about how agencies, federal agencies, through their learning agendas can help to really motivate, animate evidence-based policymaking. And I used to serve at HUD too, so these are two housers talking to each other. We'll try not to get into too much jargon, but it's exciting because HUD has been at the forefront, I think it's fair to say, in demonstrating how to put a learning agenda together. And so we're going to unpack a little bit of that this morning. So Pam, really just want to step back because you speak so eloquently and passionately about research. When you find a bit of evidence that really you think is influential, you take it around. You are the best advocate I have ever seen for promoting those evidence-based insights. So I'd love to just open up and have you reflect with us today on when you've seen new evidence that has had a big impact, what has that impact look like in terms of changing the way business gets done?
So first I have to talk about Erica. So she not only is a friend, but she's a mentor, and she's mentoring the next generation of patent nodes in the government. I have a daughter at HHS and I have a daughter at the White House, and they both adore Erica and admire her greatly. But it's Erica who really got me interested in research, and it's rare in life that you have a do-over. Well, I have a do-over for the 4th time at HUD, and I feel so much better prepared because of the time that I've spent with Erica and Sarah and all the folks here at Urban. And I spent a lot of time at Urban the last 10 years, but I have to say that was not really apparent to me when I was an assistant secretary of the research. So it's changed dramatically, and there's one reason for that, and it's Erica Poting.
Oh.
She's the one who really ramped up PD&R and was able to get the attention of the principals at HUD, and I made a commitment. We have a vacancy right now. Todd Richardson, who's wonderful, is acting, and his real job is the General Deputy Assistant Secretary. But our assistant secretary in waiting is so anxious to get there, but he's waiting to be confirmed. So I made a commitment to him that PD&R will have the resources going forward. And it looks like for our 19 budget that we're going to get an increase.
Great.
Pretty high mark on the Senate side, a very high mark. So we're excited about that. So research. So I've been at HUD since 1982 on and off. And the program that first came to mind on the research was something, they don't even call it this anymore, not even when they refer to it, even though that was the name, but the Section 8 program. This is tenant-based vouchers, but it was the research during the demonstration, and I was at HUD in 1984 when the demonstration started. This is when they were shifting a lot of changes between the certificates and the vouchers, but it was research that helped shape that program. I should back up for a minute before I hit all the other ones. There's another reason why research is so important. This is the first doctor to be the secretary of HUD, and the secretary relies heavily on research and evidence. And if we give him a study, even this big, at 8:30 in the morning, by 9:30 he's read the entire thing and can digest it that fast. So he loves research, and was thrilled to find out that we have this treasure chest of research on the shelf over decades that they've been building it. So the housing voucher program, that's our largest program that serves, even this number surprised me, 5.3 million people. That's, everybody in the households being counted. Homelessness, this is an area where HUD has excelled. And there's evidence to support that, but the Housing First approach is based on evidence. And rapid rehousing, we know from research that the cost of emergency room visits is astronomical. It has a huge impact on those of you here that are representing HHS and on the taxpayers. So that's an area that's really exciting. And that was in my portfolio when I was at HUD during the Bush 43 administration. But coming back and talking to colleagues about homelessness, we've learned a lot from that. And then another area, and it's a gold standard, and she's actually here, and this is a brand new deck that was prepared. Sarah Jarek is in the back there. She's the head of our housing counseling, and she just did this great PowerPoint with one of her colleagues from PD&R, and it talks about housing counseling. That's, financial literacy. The program's been around for a very long time, but again, research to support it. And we have needed this lately, haven't we, Sarah? So I was really happy that she gave me the deck on that. And then one other area is the work that you just did at Urban.
Yeah,
So
let's talk about that, because that's some fresh new insight into a long-standing set of studies on housing discrimination. And we're proud here at the Urban Institute because we pioneered a new methodology for measuring housing discrimination that we had the opportunity to pilot some take this kind of methodology and apply it to what's called source of income discrimination. For those of you who are not housers, that means that there are landlords who can refuse to take a Section 8 voucher and do so on the basis of sort of, this isn't, I don't need to participate in this kind of program. It's not the kind of cash that I am normally familiar with. It's this other kind of government program. Well, some counties and cities have created ordinances or laws on the books that said you can't discriminate on the basis of source of income. And so Urban went out to see whether those laws are working or what are some of the other, to what extent are landlords discriminating against Section 8 voucher holders who use the voucher to help make that housing affordable. And this is a study that was commissioned by HUD and was released in August. And would love you to reflect on how that set of insights is influencing the department right now as it thinks about how to address housing affordability challenges and make the voucher usable in many cities.
Huge influence, because Secretary Ben Carson immediately picked up on that research and said, let's have some stakeholder outreach. And when the Secretary does something, he does it, it's very comprehensive, nationwide. So Todd Richardson's actually, it may have wrapped up yesterday, but the last one was scheduled for Salem, Oregon, where they invited landlords in. And the first one was actually at HUD, and I strongly advised against it. I said, what landlords wants to come to HUD? We're a very, the building is intimidating from the outside. And they said, well, there's a metro. I said, that's true, but I still don't think you're going to get the people to come. I was wrong. I'm glad I was wrong. And they went ahead with it. But more importantly, they've gone outside of the Washington bubble. And I'm anxious to hear from Todd and the PD&R team what they learned from that.
Yeah.
And I don't know yet I haven't seen any of the summaries.
Well, and I think it also, that sort of landlord, and it's wonderful that the department has really picked that up because it's such a central issue. And we don't have a lot of evidence about why that's the case. So starting with gathering input from the landlords themselves to inform what kind of evidence could be created that would provide insight is, I think, a really smart strategy. And I want to look at the sort of learning agenda strategy now. This is one of the things that we're here today to talk about. And we have a new paper at Urban we're excited about that Keith Fudge took the lead in authoring. And HUD has, like many agencies in this room, has done learning agendas and started to do so before OMB provided guidance to that effect. And I'm curious how HUD's latest roadmap is influencing both the kind of which research is getting done or commissioned at HUD, or even informing the work on a day-to-day basis.
So our roadmap was created by Erica Potig when she was running the Office of Policy Development and Research, and this is extremely well done. And they talked a lot about the roadmap, but I didn't connect it to the learning agendas until quite frankly, yesterday. I'm leaving for Israel tomorrow, which is also connected to research. So I was so focused on that. And then I realized there's so much crossover getting ready for this presentation today and what I'll be doing, because we're going to be talking about sharing research over there. But this roadmap is a living document, which it needs to be. The housing landscape is shifting constantly, hopefully in the right direction. But as you said, there's a requirement that you look at evidence and research to be able to support, why we're requesting funding or why we're not requesting funding. It can also work to eliminate ineffective programs. So the Secretary's guidance to us was crystal clear. He only wants to fund and build on the programs that are successful. And the way that he defines success is through evidence-based, he wants facts.
Yep.
And it's required for the strategic plan, and it's required for the preparation of the budget. And they are connected, but they're also separate. So a strategic plan, I think, should also be a living document. So when we submit our plan to OMB, and we're in that phase, as you all know right now, the approaching pass-back time.
Yeah.
That narrative has to be in the budget. And then Erica said that this is going to be more formalized guidance from OMB. And I know, according to the attendee list, there were several OMB examiners. Is anyone from OMB here?
Diana, Epstein,
Okay.
others?
That's a very important agency. So somebody from OMB is actually, the head of OIRA is going with me, so on that trip. Well, they are it matters.
Yeah.
And I'm really excited about that, because Congress does sometimes fund programs that are not necessarily efficient and effective. So I'm glad to hear, though, that Congress is also focused on it with the commission.
Yeah, the commission. And I think we have Nick Hart, and I know the BPC is carrying forward
is this Nick Hart?
The commission's legacy and implementation to advance learning agendas as a critical component of what agencies do. I think one of the things what we did with the roadmap at HUD that I found extremely powerful, and I think it ties to the roundtables that Todd is doing now with the landlords, is we sought a lot of external input. We invited, we put something up, sent out an email, invited comments from around the country, got 700, I think, back. We also did roundtable conversations too, and so that's been very much sort of in the DNA of how HUD seeks input on its learning agendas.
And the new DNA, what you created.
Yeah.
Which is wonderful, and we need to continue.
Yeah,
in that
yeah.
But that before you, that was the first. That was a paradigm shift.
Yeah. And I'm curious, as you talk to folks, what are some of the things you're hearing out in the field, and especially in disaster? I mean, you have been on the front lines.
There's a huge void, I think, on the disaster, and our budget is huge. It's $52 billion a year, but that does not include supplemental funding, and we're approaching the $100 billion mark. We're shy of it, but we're heading that way rapidly. Since I arrived, and I was only confirmed 13 months ago, Congress appropriated $35.4 billion, and just 2 weeks ago appropriated another $1.7 billion, and that's just for HUD. And we haven't done a lot of research on what's working, and by design it's a block grant, so the states and sometimes local jurisdictions, but for the most part the money goes to the states because it's an enormous amount of money. And when I think about that, the entitlement grants that they get from HUD are pale compared to the grants. Puerto Rico alone, we gave them $20 billion, and the $18.5 billion was one grant, $1.5 billion. And until somebody tells me differently, that's the largest grant that's ever been awarded. Do you think we should do some research to make sure that money is well spent, and to make sure that what goes in this, we guide this program through Federal Register notice.
Yeah.
It's grounded in statute, but I call it the second cousin to CDBG, and I think we really need to focus on that.
Yeah.
And we need to focus not just on did it work well, but how can we build back better and stronger? I think we all see the newspaper and the TV with the house that survived in Pensacola Beach because it was built even beyond building code standards. And in Puerto Rico, this is an opportunity of a lifetime with we think there'll be upwards of $75 billion total investment in Puerto Rico, and much of the housing was informal. It didn't meet code. It was built with inferior materials. They're got quite an array of informal housing, and that certainly can't continue because those houses were absolutely destroyed. The ones that were built out of concrete block survived. You know, there's definitely roof problems, but those buildings were not demolished. So I think we have to look at technology. I would say, and I come from a building background, my mom was a home builder, that we build houses the same way that when my grandfather built his house 100 years ago. We have not advanced that much in the bones of building.
And is HUD investing in some of that building technology, or how are you engaging?
The secretary,
in
one of his
thinking about
first initiatives, and the secretary has some wonderful ones that we'll talk about, but he wanted to stand up an office of innovation. And I said to him, sir, I think there is already some form of that in PD&R. I had just arrived, by the way. This is like day 2, and I'd been gone for 10 years. And there is, but he's enhancing it. We're asking Congress for money to actually be able to stand it up. And we have a wonderful leader of that office, Chris Bourne. So I think that is in the works. We're just waiting for final approval on that.
Yeah, I think this is a place where there's probably a lot of opportunity for public and private partnership on both sort of research investment, but then application of those insights. And is that something that, in thinking about public-private partnerships or research, is there you see opportunities?
I do, and you know, the government, at least our agency, we don't build anything. The private sector does all the work, and they're anxious. I've spent a lot of time, weeks and weeks and weeks on the ground in Puerto Rico, and they're anxious to get started. But they have a thirst for information too. So we, especially when it comes to disaster, we need input from them. You know, from the field, from the private sector and state and local government.
So we mentioned the secretary's interest, and that he is a physician, and most folks know in this room that the standards of evidence are very high when you're trained, and there are lots of RC randomized control trials are very much incorporated in the ways in which new practices are identified and then moved through the system. So he comes, I think, with that sort of evidence-based mindset. And this intersection of housing and health is one that I think as housers we are both very excited about, because as you noted, there is a growing amount of evidence that has really shed light on those particular intersections. Some of the exciting things that I know HUD has done is matched data between the data that HUD has about the people who benefit from the assistance that HUD provides with other agencies. Would love for you to reflect on how that data matching or other efforts that the department is pursuing to advance better health outcomes through an investment in housing. Where do you see opportunities for that partnership and research?
Secretary Carson has his policy agenda. Where's my little cheat sheet card? You'd be so impressed with my artwork. The secretary, he has a prescription for HUD. So I was sitting in the meeting, I said, sir, here's your logo. I did the RX, very sophisticated artwork, and I handed it to him. Guess what? That's what we use. But that is the secretary's, so that's the header on it. So that says more about health than housing, and the secretary sees the two absolutely linked. I have worked with or for 11 of the 17 HUD secretaries. This is a new paradigm. I mean, it's really exciting that we see this link. We talked about it endlessly when I was a staff director for the BPC Housing Commission. And as a result of all those conversations, when we sunset the commission, the next step was for two of the chairs, two former HUD secretaries, Senator Mel Martinez and Secretary Henry Cisneros, immediately went into the housing and health. So that was the next iteration of it. So we know a lot about it in homelessness. I know that stable housing, it's obvious, but we do have documentation, evidence that stable project-based housing, better health outcomes. But certainly people living under a bridge are not going to have good health outcomes. So this led the Secretary to launch what is, we consider his signature policy initiative, the Envision Centers, and it has 4 pillars. And this is not new money, but bringing together the money that many of the agencies that are represented in the room already have deployed to communities, but helping people that are, the most vulnerable population who we serve have access to all of these things, whether it be job training or the community health centers. And it really is endless, because even in the FAA, and you're like, why would the FAA be involved in an initiative that is focused on helping people achieve self-sufficiency? But the Army's involved. I mean, it's amazing how many federal agencies we're pulling together, and it's a demonstration, and part of a demonstration is that you have to evaluate it. So we're at the very early stages, and the folks in PD&R are thinking about how we're going to measure it. Outcomes, we've been working on that for the entire 13 months I've been here. How are we going to measure outcomes? When you say somebody has a good outcome, what does that mean?
Yeah, that is always the rub, isn't it, right? What can you expect based on the type of intervention that you're making in terms of those kinds of outcomes? And I think, one of the, I did find in my own time at HUD that you could get HUD and HHS at the table, and there would be, light bulbs going off and a lot of realization, right?
Sparks too. My first meeting with HHS, and full disclosure, my daughter works at HHS in HRSA. She's a nurse and a lawyer, and actually went to law school because she wanted to do public policy based on what she witnessed being a nurse in a critical care unit. But I went to my first meeting, and it wasn't being sponsored by AARP, but they gave us the space, and all these people came together. And I don't know if Erica was in the room, but I know some of your former colleagues were. I didn't even know what they were talking about. I walked out of that room having no idea what just went on. I knew what our language was, but we didn't understand HHS language. And this is probably 5 years ago, so there's been a lot of advancement. The agencies talk to each other. Once upon a time, we didn't talk to each other, the federal agencies.
And are you seeing, the Envision Centers you mentioned is certainly one platform for that partnership. Are there other partnerships that you're building with parts of HHS that are creating
So
these
last week, HUD hosted U.S. Department of Agriculture, HRSA. The HRSA administrator came over and spoke. The secretary delivered the keynote in SAMHSA. And this was based on rural housing and specifically to seniors and people with disabilities and making sure they have access. So that was really nice to see. And I think on the opioid crisis, which is absolutely frightening, and it's something that I come from a state that's one of the top 5, and you do not want to be in the top 5 when it comes to opioids, but working with HHS on that in the White House, the Drug Council, and so there's a lot of interaction.
And are you getting support from Congress? So one of my reflections was that the agencies could come together, but because of the structure of Congress, those committees are different, and so it's oftentimes hard to communicate joint policy that works within the structure of the committees of Congress. So
I
I'm
can
curious
say
what your
when it comes to
experience has been.
opioids, my experience has been excellent. Congressman Turner from Ohio invited me to come out to Dayton, spent the entire day with me. We did housing and health, and opioids was the overarching theme of how we're going to do that. But the president just signed a bill with many components on with different federal agencies. So that was really exciting to see that there was bipartisan support, and these committees of jurisdiction, sometimes there's overlap, but oftentimes there isn't. So that was an example that Congress is very aware of the fact that
the very present problem of opioids.
But you can't treat somebody in a treatment center and have them go back to where they were living if that's what caused them to get there. So housing is a critical component, and one of the, I think there were 5 bills in the package. One of them is a new demo at HUD, and I don't have a lot of details on that yet because it's not new money, so the appropriators will have to do that, or we'll have to put a set aside. So, but it is the housing component, and members of Congress are looking for that.
Well, we'll look for good details on that because it is a very important and present crisis that we need to direct our attention to. So as we wrap up our conversation, we could go on forever.
Get an idea of the different agencies. I'd just love to see.
Yeah.
Is anybody here from HUD? Because the 3 folks that signed up, nobody's here from HUD.
Oh, Claudia. They're on the webcast, I'm sure.
I
So
had-
we can wave.
I had dinner with the deputy secretaries get together for formal meetings, but then we have informal dinners together, and every agency was represented except one last night. It was really cool to have everybody in the room. And we're not supposed to talk business, but you can't help yourselves. So that is also a very good sign that we can help each other.
That's great. Yeah, making those ties, as you said, to align resources around particular challenges. So as we conclude our conversation, I'd love you to reflect on sort of where you see research going in the next number of years. I think maybe HUD will be working on a new roadmap or thinking about
we will
that,
be, and I think it's
what are some of the areas of priority?
So PD&R is already working on updating the roadmap, and as I said, it's a living document. They don't want it to be stagnant, that's all we can do. The House mark is $89 million. That doesn't sound like a lot of money compared to the $52 billion, but that is more money than we usually. The Senate mark's 100, so it's going to be somewhere higher than where we are, so more money dedicated to research. I think with another supplemental, and I'm fairly certain with the devastation that was caused by Hurricane Michael, that it wouldn't be a bad idea for them to actually tell us in appropriations language that we need to do research on disaster. They give us S&E, but that's so we have the manpower to run the programs.
All right, so we hope there's some congressional staffers tuned in or in the room.
Need to make sure that we're deploying that capital that helps the people that it's intended to help.
Well, and we had a great conversation with you on another paper we've done through the Evidence-Based Policymaking Collaborative on tiered evidence grant making.
Which I found fascinating, and I had no idea what that was, but she's such a good teacher. By the end of her presentation, I got that.
So there are lots of kind of good ways to advance evidence, and HUD is at the forefront of doing so, and we are so pleased to have you kick off our conversation today.
I think there's one area with the amount of information that's out there, and there's, I don't know, so many agencies represented here, we could probably fill the room with current research, is how do we disseminate the research? And I'm too old to really appreciate going online. I'll do it if I have to, but I'd much rather somebody give me the publication and read it. And I do most of my reading on airplanes and late at night, so I don't have a computer late at night. I just want to figure out a better way, and there's a lot of people in this room that are very smart. How do we get the research out to the right people? And with HHS, I'm sure you guys know how to get the research to doctors, but we serve an enormous population, and we have a lot of constituents, and we have more stakeholders than you could ever imagine.
Yeah.
So
well,
how
that
do
is
we
a
share
really
it?
important challenge, I think, to all of us, because we invest a lot in building new evidence, and it only matters if it counts in policy and practice and changing the way we do things or investing in what works. So, so we'll get to work on that to make sure that we're communicating that not only out there, but also to the people making the decisions.
Great,
And
thank you.
Thank
I
you
always
so
love
much.
being here at
Please
Urban.
join me
Thank you.
in thanking Pam.
Well, while we're all getting mic'd up, I'll go ahead and just do a quick introduction. So thank you, first of all, for the Urban Institute for inviting us, the Bipartisan Policy Center, to join this event. As many of you probably know, and it was alluded to by Erica just now, the Bipartisan Policy Center has been working over the last year to continue some of the efforts out of the U.S. Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking. It put out a unanimous set of recommendations approximately 1 year ago, and really emphasize the role of evaluation and specifically learning agendas in the federal government and how they can help us address accountability and learning needs. You heard Diana Epstein this morning talk about some of the work that OMB has been pushing out, the Office of Management and Budget, part of the White House, encouraging every agency to develop a learning agenda. And if you haven't taken a close look at that, I really encourage you to pull up the file, look at what OMB is saying publicly about doing this work. The American Evaluation Association has issued statements applauding it. From BPC, we've issued a fair number of congratulatory statements because it is a really promising effort that we're seeing come out of the White House. In addition, we know, and it was just alluded to by the Deputy Secretary, there's legislation moving on Capitol Hill called the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act. It encapsulates some of the recommendations of the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking, including learning agendas. It's called something with a much longer title in legislation, but the core construct is of course, a learning agenda. So we have a number of agencies that are already doing this work incredibly well, and really excited to talk with several of the folks who've actually been instrumental in their agencies in developing learning agendas. You just heard about HUD's research roadmap, which fits the model. And importantly, this is a way of broadening the construct of why we do evaluation from strictly an accountability mechanism to also doing learning for continuous improvement. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that means. So I'm pleased to have three representatives of different agencies that have been working across their units to develop learning agendas. To my immediate left, Emily Schmidt, who's the Deputy Director of the Office of Planning and Research and Evaluation at the Administration for Children and Families at the Department of Health and Human Services. It's a very long title. And you've worked there since 2009, leading countless efforts around evaluation and performance activities. And you're also a former congressional staffer, so maybe you can work in some insights from that. To her left, Terrell Lassane is the lead program evaluator at the Small Business Administration, and actually helped recently develop an evaluation framework for SBA that was really useful in then developing the enterprise learning agenda that SBA is now using. Terrell is also previously a staffer in the evaluation unit at the Environmental Protection Agency, so comes with a broad range of background there. And then to his left, Melissa Patsalides is the acting Deputy Assistant Administrator at the U.S. Agency for International Development, and previously served as the Director of the Office of Learning and Evaluation and Research. Sorry, these are all really long titles, so this is a good lesson about government. So thank you all for being here. We're really excited to hear from you, and I really just want to kick this off by having each of you describe a little bit about what your agencies are doing. Tell us about the learning agenda that you have either worked on or is operational within your respective units, and how is it developed? How often is it updated? Is it public? Emily, let's start with you.
Sure. So we have three main components that together form our learning agenda. So the first is our annual research planning process. And so this is every year talking to our internal stakeholders, talking to external stakeholders, considering what have we learned from past research, where are we going, what questions remain, and forming a research plan. So we do this on an annual cycle. Almost all of our research is done through competitively awarded grants and contracts, so we generally announce that research plan through announcing the competition for those projects. Then what we also have, which is describes our ongoing research as a whole, is our portfolios of research, which we publish every year. So in our major topical areas that we focus on, we publish a compilation of all of our work that's ongoing and recently in the past, and we try to tie it together with some narrative that explains, this is what we know about this topic, this is what our ongoing work is answering, these are some key recent findings, and this is where we think we need to go from here. So that's kind of, up until this moment in time, what questions have we asked and where are we going? We also make information about our ongoing work available, so you can always come to our website and see these are our research projects, these are the questions that they're answering, this is when we're expecting these types of results. The other thing I wanted to mention is that a few of our discrete research portfolios, so for example, our home visiting research, our teen pregnancy prevention research, have learning agendas that are tools that they use to frame how they talk about research with their program partners and their stakeholders. So these are frameworks that help start a conversation about, okay, what kind of descriptive research are we doing? What kind of intervention design research are we doing? What kind of impact research are we doing? What kind of performance management are we doing? What kind of continuous quality improvement work are we doing? And how do these all tie together to answer the variety of questions that are important to answer?
All right, great. Terrell.
Okay, well, thank you. First of all, I want to thank you for being here. We consider ourselves at the Small Business Administration to be a nascent evaluation unit. But one of the things that was very exciting when I first onboarded in 2016 to start a centralized evaluation unit was the fact that there were already discussions underway about how to use learning agendas to identify the questions that are of greatest priority to the agency to improve the way we do business. In other words, to improve both efficiency and effectiveness. So we started the ground running by talking to programs. We're a fairly relatively small agency, about 2,000 employees, but we have about 36 to 38 inventoried programs, depending on which day of the week you count them and if you're talking about pilots or not. So we went out on learning agenda roadshows to ask programs what are the questions that, if answered, would make your offices run more smoothly, more effectively, more efficiently. We gathered lots of ideas. I think in some of the roadshows we gathered about 42 different questions, and we synthesized all of these into what we called our Enterprise Learning Agenda. And that is the document that was first published in February 2018, which identifies our priorities, mapped perfectly onto our strategic plan and our strategic objectives, and it helps us to frame what we want to investigate in order to make sure that we are both accountable and devoted to continuous improvement. I will say that the Learning Agenda is a living document. It's publicly published, but we revisit it every year based upon changing priorities, based on what we've learned from the evaluations the year before, the evidence that has been generated the year before, as well as based on the quality of the data, the rigor that we think we can assign to a behavioral science methodology to explore these questions, and also based upon changing priorities of leadership and administration. So we are sensitive to those things, and we have an annual call for proposals that just began 2 years ago. We're in our second call now, where we fund about 3 to 4 projects that are of high priority that come from our Enterprise Learning Agenda, and we undertake evaluations to answer the questions in those areas.
So you said the SBA plan is public. Was that an important aspect of developing it? You all wanted the plan to actually be in the hands of stakeholders?
Yes. When we started our evaluation function, we borrowed, the principles that are widely used across government: transparency, rigor, ethics, relevance, and independence. So the transparency one is we put a lot of accent on that. We want our results to be public, and we want our priorities to be public. Since ours is mapped so closely to the strategic plans, we also identify what we're doing for each of the strategic plans and objectives in terms of evidence to answer these questions. So yes, we want everyone to know about it, we want everyone to read it, and it's also part of our capacity building at the agency. If people know that this is something that we value, it's something we put emphasis on, that we think it'll help to grow our evaluation culture. And growing evaluation culture is so important for capacity and to create evidence-based decision making.
All right, Melissa, tell us about USAID.
Yes, so for folks who may not be aware, USAID is an international affairs agency, and so we are decentralized. We work in a range of sectors. Many programs are developed and implemented overseas in more than 100 overseas field offices, and some are developed and directed from Washington. So we have a little bit of a challenge in developing an enterprise learning agenda, but I am very excited because we have begun taking steps this year to be able to do that. I should say that because of our decentralized nature and our spread across sectors, we've had a number of learning agendas at USAID over the years. The first that were documented as learning agendas were probably from 2012, but if we counted earlier efforts, there were agency evaluation agendas in the 1980s. And so it's ebbed and flowed over the years, but we're very excited now to be moving in the direction of having something that covers the broad priority policy areas for the agency. And so one of those this year was really clear for us was what our administrator is calling the journey to self-reliance. So this is a very clear policy priority for USAID, that basically we should be working ourselves out of a job. We should be aiming to improve the capacity of the countries where we work and their commitment to solve their own development challenges. So what does that actually mean? we basically need to be looking at how we're moving countries on those trajectories. So that's a very clear policy priority that we have now, and all of our Washington bureaus as well as overseas field units are moving in that direction. So that greatly facilitates our ability to develop a learning agenda that's going to be useful throughout the agency. So we really launched that this summer. And we've done a number of consultations inside the agency. Obviously, this is a new policy area, so questions are natural and range from substantive and technical areas to operational areas. And I fully expect that when we complete our work on our first sort of set of questions, we're going to have a lot of interesting kinds of questions that are part of our learning agenda. We're thinking of it in short, medium, and long-term questions, and we have what I'm calling our first customers coming up in the next few months, really. We have some priority questions around how this is incorporated into strategic planning within our countries, and we need those answers fairly quickly because it's going to inform changes in our policy and guidance in that area. So those are sort of a group of short-term questions that we have, and we're beginning a literature review that's going to set the foundation for additional consultations and some of the medium to longer term questions. We know there is already a lot of evidence and research around sustainability, around use of country systems and local systems. So we want to capitalize on all of that and be able to move forward and plans other research and evaluations and additional evidence gathering activities that will help us be able to answer those questions. I'm hoping we'll be able to publish that in January. It is, I think, also important that we publish what our learning agenda is, not only for transparency, but also to signal to a lot of we have a lot of stakeholders too who range from academia to implementers, many of whom are conducting research in international development. And so it's going to be important for us to signal what are our research priorities so that we're able to then corral additional support, signal to the external community what is it we're undertaking, what may we be wanting to partner on, what may some of the independent academics and others just take and run with, and then the broader international development community could benefit from that. So we fully anticipate that it's going to be iterative. We have a lot of questions about the journey to self-reliance and how we operationalize that and change the way we work as an agency. So we're going to need to be answering those questions as soon as we can. And then I think as soon as we answer some of those questions, we're going to have new ones. So we anticipate keeping our learning agenda updated, I think probably on a semi-annual basis, but certainly at least annually. And then we have hopefully the impetus from OMB to be asked to speak to that in our annual budget submissions and strategic review processes with them. So that is a benefit to be able to use existing processes to infuse the evidence that we're generating and driving senior level attention to that. So that's great.
So I think you've just highlighted something really important, which is there are a lot of people that have learning agendas that may think about them as a slightly different construct. So we heard just in the previous discussion that HUD has something called the Research Roadmap. Well, that doesn't say learning agenda. Terrell, yours is called the Enterprise Learning Agenda. Emily, what's yours called?
Looking for a title.
Okay, unnamed. And what do you actually call yours a learning agenda?
We do, and right now we're calling it the self-reliance learning agenda because it's focused on this one particular policy priority. We hope that in the next iteration of ourselves, we will be able to broaden that into something that is, we may end up calling it the agency learning agenda or an enterprise learning agenda.
And Congress is calling these evidence-based policymaking plans. Right, so the terminology here is sort of important, that when we're describing learning agenda, there's a lot of different configurations of what these can be. You heard Diana describe that flexibility is really important. And one of the big goals is that, as you've just heard, these three models are all a little bit different. One of them's unnamed and they have slightly different titles. But the goal is to have this plan that helps us figure out what evidence we need to be generating across agencies. In some cases, they're made public. In some cases, they're more internal documents. But you heard all three of the speakers also allude to stakeholders. So let's turn and talk about how stakeholders were involved in your respective processes. So maybe some more formal than others. Emily, can you tell us what was the role of stakeholders at ACF?
Sure. So I'll talk first about our internal stakeholders and then about our external stakeholders. So internally, all of our research funding, for the most part, is tied to specific programs. So it's really important for us to get feedback and buy-in from those program partners. So we spend a lot of time, both in ongoing conversation, but also in specific research planning conversations with the program partners, trying to understand what are critical issues facing your program that you'd like issues for in the short term, in the long run. Our program partners have closer relationships with their stakeholders and grantees, so we want to hear what they're hearing from the field. So we do this kind of informally on an ongoing basis, but then informally as we start our research planning process every year. Externally, we have a range of informal to formal ways that we do this. So we try to, of course, keep a pulse on the field, attend conferences, attend events, talk to people about what they think is important. We also have some more formal ways that we do this. So I'll give one example for our welfare and family self-sufficiency research portfolio. We semi-regularly convene a group of experts that has representatives from research firms, academia, philanthropy, in this case, state TANF representatives. And what we want to know from them is not necessarily tied to our annual process, but on a longer term, larger scale look. This is what we've been working on. Based on what we're telling you, where should we be headed? What's going on out there that we want to be sure not to duplicate? What can we complement? Are there gaps out there that the federal government is uniquely suited to fill? So we want to hear from them to reflect on what we're already doing and give us feedback on where we might go, given their perspective on the state of the field. Of course, we sometimes also get direction from Congress, so we have some research and evaluation activities that are congressionally mandated, and then we put all this together into making our research plan.
All right, Terrell, you mentioned roadshows earlier. Tell us what a roadshow is.
Well, the roadshow is actually an hands-on interaction with programs in our SBA, and we took that opportunity to talk to those people who are working on the ground, program staff, to find out, help them identify if your program, if you could change one thing about your program, what would you do? What would you want answered in order to improve this? Now, I can preface this by saying that we're located in the Office of Performance Management, in the Office of the Chief Financial Officer. So we have a particular responsibility to administer GIPRMA, the reporting standards of accountability and performance reporting. So we took advantage of that, synergy with the performance management functions of our office when we were standing an evaluation function, and said, while we're talking to programs and collecting data about whether they've met their goals, whether they're meeting their priorities, let's also ask some questions about, is this performance information useful to you for performance management decisions? And we got a lot of feedback from our internal assessment that while the performance reporting was important and people valued it, that there were other questions that they weren't getting that could inform issues of process and issues of outcomes, so efficiency and effectiveness. So we went to talk to people on staff and find out, what is your wish list? What are things you want answered to know? We ground truth that with staff members, senior managers and staff members, to find out if these were priorities that they also had. So there was a lot of talking to all parties in order to make sure that we were all in sync and that these were questions that would be prioritized by everyone in the agency. Something else that we were able to do is we were able to look at the data systems. SBA houses a lot of data, and we had opportunities to match that data with statistical agencies in order to look at questions aside from efficiency and effectiveness, but actually impact, to find out if our programs were actually making the types of impacts on the generation of revenue and the creation of jobs that it's our ultimate mission to do. So we have talked with people inside the agency at all levels, from staff level to senior management, getting ground truth and sort of going back and forth to determine what is something we all agree is something that it's important for us to look at. We've also taken an opportunity to look at data systems and to partner. I think that they mentioned the Arnold Foundation, who's helping to support this event. We've had conversations with the Arnold Foundation as well as academic institutions to find out how we could partner to match this data and to look at some impact studies. So we have looked at learning agendas from multiple ways, but the Learning Agenda Roadshows is the one that I think is most tied to employee empowerment, stakeholder engagement, because people are saying you're actually asking us what information we can collect that's going to help us do business better, as opposed to only satisfying a directive for GIPRMA or some accountability mechanism.
Great. Well, I love calling it roadshows. It makes it sound really exciting. So.
It does. I like that. I might steal that idea. That's really great. So in terms of consultations, we've had a lot of internal consultations with staff inside the agency. And I mentioned earlier our first customers. That's one of the teams actually in my bureau that is responsible for guiding the strategic planning process for our overseas missions. And so they're under the gun literally to implement this policy directive in very short order with the existing policy guidance that we have, and they're trying to figure out very quickly, okay, how does this need to change? So that office has been very intimately engaged in consultations because they have the burden of providing guidance and support to the strategic planning process. So that's been one of our primary stakeholder groups thus far. We've also I should say that this is, again, the first agency-wide learning agenda we're taking on. And so we are, at the same time we're taking this on, we're getting people in the agency used to us performing this function. And so we're pushing in some areas and being directive and proactive, and in other areas we're being opportunistic and just trying to mine existing data or existing learning agendas or activities that are ongoing. And interestingly, one of those was a survey that went out to our heads of missions, overseas field offices, asking them sort of what do they need to know in order to implement this new policy focus. So I said, great, this is a fabulous data source for us. Let's mine it. Let's figure out then how do these questions align with the questions that we've already surfaced? What do we already have answers to? Where can we communicate that quickly? And then what are some of these questions that are going to become part of our broader and longer term learning agenda? I should also say we hosted in early September an evaluation summit where we convened our staff inside the agency who work on monitoring and evaluation, and then the external evaluation community among international development evaluators. So we got some interesting methodological ideas. We had a lot of methodological questions, and we're using that summit to focus on those angles of the questions and also the approaches that we might take to be able to answer these questions. We're planning some additional consultations in the agency and thinking about how to engage strategically among senior leaders for whom learning agenda may never be a common part of their lexicon, and it may not matter if it is, but I do want evidence to be part of their lexicon. And so thinking about how do we engage with those folks who are newer to the agency leadership structure and get them on board, and also figure out what are the questions that they have. But I like the idea of a roadshow. I think maybe we can steal that.
So you all have some process of engaging with folks outside your agencies to get feedback on research priorities. Can you imagine doing this process at all without talking to the folks outside of government who are contributing in some way? No.
I cannot. I think that, I don't know if we're going in order. Do you want to?
Go ahead. Yeah.
We have really relied on partners. Part of our internal assessment that I talked about was finding out what the state of play was in the use of evidence and evaluation within our agency. But the next step was a federal benchmarking study where we spoke to people, most of the people on the stage are members of their organizations, and a lot of people under the audience are familiar faces, to find out what were the best practices used. And we also leveraged organizations like the American Evaluation Association, the Federal Evaluation, the Washington Evaluators Association, to make connections to find out who was doing work within private sector, within agencies, within foundations, within academic institutions that could help us to advance our evaluation goals. There are lots of best and promising practices out there. I don't really consider any of the things that we've done in our framework particularly original, except for maybe Learning Agenda Roadshow is a moniker to describe how we do our outreach. So I think that all people are involved. Certainly those of us in the federal family have a lot in common, and we can relate to changes such as administration, political leadership, changing priorities and things like that. But we certainly can still learn best practices to deploy evaluation and to make sure evidence is used and leveraged effectively for decision making.
Well, I was glad to see you all say, no, you can't imagine doing this without external stakeholders, because I'm not in government. The Urban Institute's obviously not governmental. Results for America, and I think there's a lot of folks in the audience here that are potential stakeholders for all of you that I know are eager to not just learn about how your agencies, but all of the other agencies out there that are starting to develop learning agendas can benefit from their feedback. So it was a loaded question. I apologize for that. Let's turn to the political leadership. You've alluded to it. There was some reference to strategic planning, which is often on the minds of political appointees. Let's talk about how political appointees have been involved or not in your respective processes. Do you reach out to them directly? Do they provide feedback? Do they even know what your the Untitled Learning Agenda is, or your respective documents? Emily, you want to go first?
Sure. So at the Administration for Children and Families, we of course have political leadership at the Assistant Secretary level, but also all of our, for the most part, our program offices are also headed by political leaders. So I would say that across administrations and across the different people who have been in those positions, we would start by asking them what their preference is, right? So we've had some who would say, assistant secretaries who would say, come to me early, I want to give you a broad brush of my priorities, and then I want you to work to flesh that out. We've had others who say, go talk to the program offices, I want to see a plan that reflects the input of the program offices before I weigh in. So I would say, the first step is to see what the preference is of the person who's in leadership at the time, and that we have worked in a variety of ways. But always we would, at some point in our process, get the buy-in and the approval of our political leadership, and then our spend plan would always need final sign-off from our assistant secretary.
Okay, Terrell?
We're lucky, and again, we're a relatively small organization, and our CFO is, oversees the Office of Performance Management. And because of our performance reporting cycle and many of the products that we have an opportunity to infuse evaluation results into quarterly deep dive reporting, into the annual performance plan, into an annual financial report. But we still have learned in the first years, we've had lessons, we've harvested lessons learned from standing up the function, that it's very important to go directly to senior managers, particularly those with politicals, because quite frankly, our focus is on creating evaluation reports and evaluation results that can be leveraged for decision making. And those are the people who are likely to make the decision making. So we have made sure that our community of practice, which includes those in our community who are interested in evaluation and measurement and decision making, members of our evaluation teams, which include subject matter experts from the programs, that they are in constant communication with their senior leadership, and that we are reinforcing that by having our senior leadership, our CFO, Tim Gribben, Jason Boss, the Director of Performance Management, communicate directly with the political leadership to make sure that we're on target, and that what we're studying and suggesting that we should study and generating evidence for are things that they value as well. So we've done a checks and balances, and we are trying to do even more of that, because we realize that sometimes amnesia sets in and people don't remember exactly what they said they were interested in doing, and we have to do little subtle and gentle reminders.
That's very diplomatic. Melissa?
Yes, so we have the good fortune of being, my bureau, which is the Policy Planning and Learning Bureau, is our assistant to the administrator just started at the end of July. So that was our first political leadership in our bureau. And so we capitalized on his arrival and the fact that we were also the bureau charged with really leading this journey to self-reliance within our agency, to get in front of him and to get in front of, there's a body of leaders, political and just career staff bureau leaders within our agency. They meet weekly and they're talking about all of these ideas around the government reorganization, the transformation. It's really a vetting body for the proposals around changed processes and structures. And that was I capitalized on that. It's an ad hoc body, but I said this is the place we want to be. So we presented to them on what questions might we have as an agency around self-reliance, and the fact that we probably should undertake ways of answering those questions, and we might call it a learning agenda. And so we got their input, and it was a fabulous opportunity for the career staff, the long-term career staff, and the political staff to interact together around those questions, which I think is really important because you hear very different perspectives depending on where people are coming from. So that was really valuable. And now we're actually brainstorming the next step in the process, which is to formalize. We're going to have a lot of questions, and we're not going to be able to answer all of them. And so we're getting ready to go through that prioritization process and talking about what process do we want to use within our agency to get leadership buy-in, because obviously we'll be committing ourselves in terms of our staff time and some resources to that, and then making the case continuously for others or for ourselves for additional resources to be able to continually work on that learning agenda. So we're brainstorming that actually right now, because it is really important that, the core of the leadership of the agency in terms of the career staff as well as political leadership are bought into this, because we do want it to be a multi-year learning agenda. Obviously, this policy priority around self-reliance is not a 1 or 2 year thing. We need to plug away at this over a number of years. And so to deal with that amnesia issue, it's really important to have a mix of senior leaders within the agency who are bought into it and who are waiting for those answers.
So senior leaders come and go. Political appointees don't stay forever, in theory. So in many agencies that don't have strong evaluation units today, so, you're all in a case where you've got some core capacity that exists. You've all been instrumental in developing it, whether it's new or it's been around for decades. What's your sense of how valuable a learning agenda could be for an agency that's trying to develop capacity from the ground up? They don't have a strong history of evaluation. Is it a mechanism that you can develop from the bottom up to convince political leadership the value of evidence generation and use, in your opinion? I'll open that up to anyone.
I feel like Terrell should start, since you guys went from 0 to 60 in a matter of a year or so.
Yeah, well, again, I think we benefited so much from learning from other agencies, and we've made, very intentional in our efforts to get ideas from, Diana's group, from Demetra, to sort of host through our community of practice interagency discussions. But I think that owing partly to the size of our agency and to the fact that, people are very involved and that there's not a lot of distance between staff and senior leadership, that we are able to use the learning agenda process to engage staff and to get them excited about it. One of the things we did in addition to the Learning Agenda roadshows is we published guidelines for evaluating a small business administration program, which was a how-to manual about how you would go about doing an evaluation, what are the principles on which evaluation is based. Our framework is published with it. Many of you have probably gotten copies or downloaded copies. We're doing our 2nd edition right now. We've revised it based on lessons learned. But we have found that the Enterprise Learning Agenda to be a valuable tool, because we have the captive audience of both staff at all levels. And I failed to mention before, and I didn't, that was just a grave oversight, that our field, we make sure our field are aligned. They're members of the community of practice, and we make sure we're in communication with them, because the people who are not on site at headquarters are also, implementing some of these programs and these changes, and their insights are invaluable. So we are involving people and getting people excited through our community of practice and through results. One of the things after the results of an evaluation are published, and we just finished our first class, we're continuing to engage with the programs and their leadership and saying, well, this is what you found. How are you going to use these results? How can we help you problem solve? These are some of the recommendations that grew out of there. What is your next step? How can we help? And so the learning agenda process has been interactive, very intentional, and continuous. We've tried to iterate based upon what we found and what we're learning as we go along.
I would just add that I think the term learning agenda is a really nice one to use. So as you said, we've been doing this for years. We don't have a title for what we do, but we've started actually talking to our program partners about learning rather than research and evaluation, because it's kind of a friendlier open to say, how can we help you learn about your program than, how can we do research on your program?
I would absolutely agree with that. It's a much more palatable way to invite people into the evidence space. And I think if you start with what are the questions that we have, and then demonstrate that there are a wide array of ways to answer those questions, you're not automatically going to a randomized control trial, you're not automatically going to a complicated research design, then you can buy people in who may not otherwise be bought into the concept of evidence gathering and using evidence. And it's much more suitable for the kinds of agencies we all work in, where not everybody is focused on evaluation or methodology questions all of the time. I would also say, I think that one thing that's important for beginning the process is absolutely having some short-term questions that can be answered, so that you're very quickly demonstrating the value of the learning agenda. I think that will gain more followers than focusing only on long-term questions for which you have a very complex evaluation or research plan, and which will be answered in 24 months to 36 months. I think that's having a range of short, medium, and long-term, and demonstrating the value of the learning agenda quickly to people who are going to use that information is really important to try to build it from the ground up.
Great. So let's pivot and talk about usefulness and use. So obviously, getting leaders bought into the concept of using evidence is, of course, one goal or one potential use of a learning agenda, but it's not the only one. We also want to be able to produce new research and address the questions that are really encapsulated there. What's been your experience in terms of how your agencies have actually used this on the ground? Is it really getting beyond the we're talking about evidence to we're actually making a difference in developing studies to answer the questions that we really have? Maybe, Mosa, can I start with you?
Sure. So I won't speak for the self-reliance learning agenda since we've just kicked that off, but I know we're about to use some of those answers to modify some guidance. But I would speak maybe for some of the other learning agendas that have been in use in the agency. Our Bureau for Food Security had a learning agenda associated with its first strategy, and as a result of some of the evaluation findings, they had modified their global strategy around agriculture, nutrition, I believe that update was last year, so in 2017. So there we have an example of a global learning agenda, a global strategy that had an associated learning agenda that was modified, and that then impacted the types of programs that were done in countries worldwide as a result of that. So I think that's a pretty powerful example of use in terms of effect on agency program dollars.
Okay, good. Emily?
Sure. So I think there's three main avenues by which our research findings affect ACF programs and policies. The first is by taking research and evidence into account in writing regulations for programs, and we've certainly seen that when a program is reauthorized, the program office can build on our body of evidence to inform regulation. The second is in writing grant announcements. So a recent example with our health profession opportunity grants has a robust evaluation portfolio, and when the second round of the funding opportunity announcement was being written, they were able to draw on early findings from the research on the first round to change some of the emphasis in the grant. I think the third is just in information kind of entering the public consciousness. So I'll point to our behavioral science work, and not that, we've had successful experiments, people aren't going to go out and exactly replicate those interventions, but they might keep in mind as they're designing a new program to build in reminders or make the programs easier to access.
All right, great. And Terrell?
Well, we've just finished our first class of evaluations in our centralized unit, but I'm very encouraged. Just earlier this week, I met with Boots to Business, one of our flagship programs in the Office of Veteran and Business Development, and we had done an evaluation with them, and their senior leadership was interested in knowing, okay, I've read the report, it looks great, help us to use these results, to leverage these results for program improvement. And I really attribute that to the fact that we have formed evaluation teams with such engaged stakeholders, subject matter experts, program managers, who are sitting in these meetings and who are able to tell us what has emerged as the burning questions for the program. Sometimes it will change, and Dina Mowgli and my colleague here can attest to the fact that from when we started the evaluation, as we went through, things happened in the field that suggested that we wanted to take a closer look at one aspect or another. It's good to be nimble like that, because if your focus is on use, then you are more, inclined to make those midstream changes. But I think that just having the field, the team members who are, constantly going to their management. I think Dina probably briefed them at least monthly, maybe bi-weekly, about what was going on with the evaluation, what we're learning, and how can we use this. And by the time the evaluation was complete, there was already an appetite for figuring out, okay, we need to find out how to leverage this evidence to improve our programs. And I will just say something else. Like Melissa, I think we went for, in our initial year of evaluations, for low-hanging fruit. Let's find out those small questions scoped in such a way that, well, it doesn't cost a great deal of money, so that people can get excited about the results and how they can be used fairly quickly in order to leverage results for program improvement.
So I've heard your CFO, Tim Gribben, describe several times that shortly after you put the enterprise learning agenda out, researchers approached you to ask for access to administrative data that SBA has that could help answer the questions. Have you all sort of seen things like this happen, where you start talking about what's in your learning agenda and people, researchers outside government, actually start coming forward, trying to figure out ways to help you, even without giving them money?
Yeah, it's, well, as a former college professor who sought tenure at one point, I know that you'll do about anything to get good data and to, have ready access for a ready-made publication. So we were very lucky in that sense, but also we have a great team. Brittany Borg, who's our co-lead program evaluator and who actually took the lead on the enterprise learning agenda, is very resourceful, has made connections. My experiences working with Catherine Dawes at the EPA led me to interact with people like Valerie Caracelli, Stephanie Shipman, Diana Epstein. So we had people who knew other people who could connect us, and we were able to leverage those social networks in order to start that. But yes, I was not necessarily surprised that people were so willing to say, we will analyze your data for free. I just need a publication, or I want a publication, or I'm just so interested in this subject matter.
So let me maybe just ask each of you quickly, since we're talking about cost now. So there might be a perception out there that developing a learning agenda is this massive, costly enterprise. Has that been your experience? Is it something that obviously it takes people's time and some amount of resources, but is this a big government, expansive activity?
I wouldn't say that it's extremely costly. I would say that there should be dedicated resources for it if you're planning to undertake research or evaluation in addition to the staff time to oversee it, and then to engage people with the findings. I think that's going to be very telling what kinds of approaches we use to engage people with the findings, and I anticipate that some of those are going to be very modest cost. So I wouldn't say that it's necessarily a very costly undertaking, but I think if we're talking about improving programs, improving efficiency or effectiveness of what we're doing, I prefer to think of that as that should be part of how we operate. That shouldn't be thought of as page 118 of a publication or a gravy or frosting on the top. It really should be part of the way we work to gather evidence about what we're doing to ensure that it is as sound as it can be. So I won't say no, it doesn't cost anything, because it does cost something, but it's not. I don't anticipate this being a very expensive undertaking.
All right, we've got some time for questions from the audience, and for folks who are watching the webcast live, you can submit questions to events@urban.org. All right, folks, what questions do we have? Right here. Actually, can you use the microphone?
A lot of times I think a lot of us are running into folks who say, I can't change anything because I'm locked in. I have to do it this way because my sponsor tells me to, or various excuses for why things they can't adjust, can't reprioritize. What do you do about that, kind of the soft side of this?
Anyone?
Well, I think that one of the things that we've tried to do through stakeholder engagement, through the learning agenda exercises, is that we are generally interested in what you have to say. And we know that because you're working on the ground and because of various levels you have at the program, that you have a voice that's valued and needs to be heard. And we would like to use this information to improve life for everybody. That's easier said than done sometimes. I think that what we are very good at SBA is really talking to people, who are directly involved in the programs and saying, we think that we can help you. So we see evaluation and evidence as something that's being done with you and for you, not to you. And so keeping the accent on program improvement, continuous improvement, and not threatening them with the specter that this evaluation is going to be a referendum on whether your program should be funded or defunded. We're trying to find out what works best, and why. And if there are any resource improvements, we can use that, allocate those for innovation, for improvements in other areas. So we try to keep the accent on program improvement, and that seems to get people a little more engaged and less anxious about evaluation.
Yeah. Emily, Melissa, anything to add?
I would just say I think this underscores the importance of stakeholder input on the front end, because you want to make sure you're answering questions that are going to be useful and have actionable answers on the back end. So it's like you said, not going in and saying, should this program exist or not exist, but are there things we can learn about how to help you improve your program that then is within your power to act on?
The one thing I would add is just challenge that person. I mean, what's the law? What's the regulation? What's the policy that says that you can't change? Usually they can't produce it. Usually it's folklore. It's true. So, and then if you do have evidence that says something should change and somebody doesn't want to, then I think that's a really powerful conversation to have at a leadership level, to say, guess what? We need to adjust. We need to do something differently. We need to figure out how to make it happen.
Great. Other questions? Let's go over here.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Rebecca Cruz. I'm from the National Science Foundation. We're finding that it's not just about delivering the right evidence to the right people at the right time, but that in order to go from evidence to actionable insights to making decisions and taking action, it requires time and it requires structure and facilitation. And so I'm just wondering if you've encountered similar experiences, and if so, what those kinds of engagements are. And I think Melissa began alluding to this, but if you could maybe flesh out a little bit more detail if you have any insights. Thank you.
Sounds like that's a question for Melissa.
Sure. So I would say that that's absolutely right, is that thinking about how people would engage with this data and make sense of it, with this evidence and make sense of it, is a really important part of the process. That definitely takes facilitation, that takes a thoughtful approach, that may be a different skill set than is resident all of the time in a typical research or evaluation office. So thinking about who are those people who can actually have those facilitative conversations is really important, and thinking about the processes that would be used is just as critical. So that's an area that my office has focused on a lot in the last 8 years, really, and I think it's something that we should all grapple with.
All right, next question. In the back.
Hi, my name's Letitia Braga. I'm with the U.S. Department of Education. So we have the evidence learning agenda, and more informally, we've been talking about the evidence training agenda around building capacity internally and externally. And so I'd be curious to hear some about your experiences of, given limited resources, the investments around training and hiring around, specialists who, can do the research work, the data work, but also investing in staff who may not have a research background, but who may be doing the monitoring, for example, of programs that had an evidence requirement, and may need to be thinking about what questions do you ask along the grant life cycle to be able to monitor that grant. So Just, those are kind of different groups, and wondering if you have experience with that in your respective agencies.
Emily, I think you might be the first
Sure.
one I'd turn to on this.
So is this a question about hiring staff for your evaluation office?
Or in terms of just broader training. So there's needs around capacity building and hiring people who are specific experts, but then there's also broader capacity building around understanding the evidence terminology and being able to monitor grants that may have an evidence component. And those people may not necessarily be people with a research background. And so how much do you invest in that type of work, and do you have examples of successful training in that area?
Sure. So I'll say a few things which hopefully will answer your question. So I won't talk too much about hiring on the front end. Of course, it's a challenge. Anyone who works in a federal agency knows that. But we do have managed to build up a great staff at the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation. We do engage in ongoing training related to methods, kind of some basic, making sure people are up to date, and then also opportunities to be trained in more specialized methods. And we typically would bring in outside experts to consult with on that. And then we also do place an emphasis on training for our field. So putting effort into evaluation TA for Administrative for Children and Families grantees so that they are also better consumers and users of evidence. So kind of at all levels, yes, I think it's important to continually be training and building the capacity of staff and stakeholders.
So I want to turn to a question from an employee at the Government Accountability Office that was emailed in. And this is not part of an audit, I'm assuming, so you should feel free to respond openly here. How do you address cultural competency and sensitivity in your respective work? Is it part of the conversation in the learning agenda development? Does it come through in your evaluation protocols?
Cultural competency and sensitivity.
So you work in a lot of different countries.
A lot of different cultures. Yeah. So if I'm going to assume I understand the question and take a stab. We definitely have, our policy has principles around evaluation, and I can't quote them right now, but certainly relevance to stakeholders and beneficiaries is sort of one of the thematic areas, making sure to engage stakeholders as part of preferably the intervention design process, but definitely the evaluation design process, and thinking about how do you get those perspectives into the evaluation, because often those could be the perspectives that question our assumptions that are not always explicit. So that's one of the real values of evaluation, is being able to dig and find those other perspectives that you, the program manager, or you, the evaluation commissioner, were not thinking of. So making sure that that's sort of that 360 view of the evaluation questions and the evaluation process is a really important part of the process to try to get at that, especially in international development.
Yeah, it seems like it's really built into your entire process.
Yeah.
All right, other questions? Right here.
Thank you. So not all evidence is the same, and not all leadership's ideas on what evidence is the same. So I'm wondering how you talk about the different levels of quality of evidence, and usually higher quality evidence needs more investment, and lower quality evidence can be quicker to obtain. So how do you talk about the different types of data that your offices are able to generate, and the extent to which they can really fully answer any kind of question that you might have?
So this might be a good question for each of you. I don't know who wants to go first.
I'll take a stab. As per OMB suggestions, we try to use an inclusive evidence base that includes not only peer-reviewed journals from academic institutions, but evaluation evidence, practitioner knowledge, and we try to emphasize that rigor comes in different forms and fashions. We certainly have statistical validity, we have internal validity, external validity. Those are things that as behavioral scientists we try to emphasize, but that all evidence can be used, that we just need to put the proper qualifiers on it. That we need to say that this, let's not overstretch what we can say with this result. This is not an RCT, but it can give us evidence that will help us to build the case for making a claim or for extolling the benefits of a program or an area where a program needs to change. So I think just making qualifiers, and that goes back to the training and capacity that was talked about in our guidelines. We actually train people about the different classes of evidence and what constitutes rigor on a continuum, but showing that qualitative, quantitative methods are all of value and that they can help us answer questions.
I think I would just add, so we have an evaluation policy. The first principle is rigor, meaning for the question that we're asking, we want to use the most rigorous methods possible. Doesn't mean we are going to do a random assignment experiment for everything, because that's not appropriate for every question, but that you should be using methods that are going to appropriately answer the question that you're asking. And when, I think another message we give is that low quality evaluation isn't inexpensive. You're spending money, and then you may not be confident about the answer at the other end. So it's not a way to save money if it's not going to answer the question that you're interested in asking.
Mm-hmm. I would definitely underscore what my colleagues mentioned, and also we don't have this universally. There are a couple of sectors that have sort of hierarchies of evidence. I know there are other U.S. government agencies who absolutely have those and use them in their grant making. It's something that I've had on my to-do list for about 9 months in terms of exploring whether we can provide some kind of rubric to give as a heuristic, definitely not as a hard and fast rule, but in terms of the kinds of decisions and what kinds of rigor might be needed for those decisions, and then what kinds of methods might produce that kind of rigor. There are definitely some great examples, I think, from other U.S. government agencies. I'm wrestling with whether that's something we can apply generally within USAID or if it's still sector by sector.
Yeah, so I think I might summarize this in a slightly different way and say method is not a proxy for quality. So we like to start with the question and then figure out what to do after that. I was recently in a meeting on Capitol Hill where a really fabulous experimental RCT had been conducted of a program, but it didn't actually answer the question that the office was interested in, and they had been the ones that wrote it into legislation. So, there's an important issue to be raised here about making sure that we're actually answering the questions that are priorities. And I think we've heard the panel describe as learning agendas are one way that we can sort of make sure the questions that people actually want to know the answers to are documented well. All right, I think we have maybe time for one more question. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Holly Donnelly with the IRS. We spend a lot of resources on data and getting the data in good shape to be able to answer our questions. Can you each talk a little bit about whether you address data infrastructure issues in your learning agendas?
Data infrastructure. Is data infrastructure part of your learning agenda?
So I'll start. So we have a relatively new function in our office that is focused on data and using data for improvement. And so we have plans to pay a lot of increasing attention to the data that ACF program offices have, how it can be used for the programs, how it can be used for research. So yes, it's important, and we are building up that function in our office.
I will speak, having worked at only 2 federal agencies, but I am just amazed at how much administrative data we collect, sometimes by statute, and sometimes just because we think at the time these are questions we should ask, but that are not leveraged and not used. So that is something that we haven't formally paid attention to, but in our lessons learned after the first year of launching our evaluation, we are certainly paying close attention to data systems, the quality of data, the shortcomings, and trying to think at this goal as a maturity function of trying to get our data sort of in some sync on different systems, because a different office will have a completely different data system that, if it were to be matched with another data, could really give us some interesting lessons to be learned. So it's something that we have our eye on, but we don't have a formal process for, and I do think it's something that we want to look at systematically.
Mm-hmm. I wouldn't say necessarily with regard to the learning agenda, but data quality is sort of a superseding issue in most agencies, whether it's how programmatic data is collected, the monitoring data, whether it is evaluation data, whether it's research data. So I would say that we have data quality standards that have been part of our policy and guidance forever and ever. And that's something that we expect our staff and then would expect ourselves also with our own learning agenda to look at and to try to use and to be aware of data quality limitations and to factor that into decisions that may be made on the basis of that data.
So one last question as we wrap up, just a quick fire response from each of you. We have a lot of folks that may be starting the process of developing a learning agenda. What's the best advice you can give them as they get off the ground? Emily?
So I think a thread through all of our conversations has been the importance of engaging your stakeholders and going out and emphasizing to people that this is about learning. It's not scary. It's about asking questions that will help you improve your program, and then making sure that those questions you develop are going to be useful to them on the back end. So I think that that's been a thread through our conversations.
Yes, what she said. Seriously, stakeholder engagement and employee empowerment, saying that we value your voices being heard. You are passionate about this program. We value what you have to say. We know that your advice and inputs can really improve the way we do business. So, giving people the sense that they are empowered to change organizations for the betterment.
Yeah, I think focusing on what do we need to know in order to do X, whether it's carry out this policy priority, whether it's improve this program, whether it's design this new thing, what do we need to know? And how are we going to use that? So rehearsing what those answers, like what might those answers be? Rehearse your data. How might it be used? And use that to then go back and inform the process that you use to further hone those questions and who you're consulting with. So making sure that you've got stakeholders who are actually going to use the data on the back end of the learning agenda in actual tangible ways.
Those sound like all good points of advice for folks. So if you're in the process of starting a learning agenda, hopefully you'll have a good starting point. I want to say thank you to each of you for sharing your insights. Let's give them a round of applause. And to conclude the event, I'd like to invite Maya Jakimowicz, if I got it right, who is the Vice President of the Evidence-Based Policy Implementation Effort at Results for America, to offer some closing remarks.
Thanks, Nick, so much, and thanks to the Bipartisan Policy Center and Urban Institute for having Results for America be a part of this conversation. We'd also really like to thank and reemphasize the Laura and John Arnold Foundation for without their generous support, so much of this work wouldn't be able to happen. And thanks to all of you for being a part of this conversation. I think the benefit of this type of event is really it's a learning opportunity for the panelists, but also for all of us here in the audience. And I want to applaud all of you for the important work that you're doing. I think you guys are examples, really shining examples of what's happening at the federal level that the rest of us can learn from. It Results for America, we focus, laser focused on helping government better use data and evidence to make policy decisions. We think all of their decisions should be grounded in the best quality data and evidence that's available. And we, at the federal level, we have an annual federal index that highlights those elements that we think are really important for agencies and departments to be focused on. Learning agendas is an important piece of that federal index. So if you're interested in learning more, there's some information in the back about that. At Results for America, what I do is I run our local government fellowship program. This is a program with 16 different cities and counties working across the country, deputy mayors, chiefs of staff, budget directors, and others who are focused on grounding their work in data and evidence. They care deeply about making better policy, programmatic, and budget decisions through the use of data and evidence. And I can say from their perspective that they are so eager to learn about the work that you guys are doing at the federal level. There are some bright spots, there are some pockets of excellence in local government where they are using learning agendas or some version of a learning agenda. I know the titles differ. In one example, in King County, Washington, they have a Best Starts for Kids initiative where they're wholly focused on improving outcomes for their youth from the earliest years into older age youth. And they have an entire evaluation and performance management plan around their new levy, their new tax levy that helps provide funding for the programming. And to them, it's so important to understand not just what's working and what gaps in knowledge do we have, but how do we think about a long-term strategy, which is a lot of what I heard reflected from you guys in the panel. It's important to both answer short and medium-term questions, but also long-term questions through the learning agenda. I also want to lift up the example in New York City, the Mayor's Office of Economic Opportunity, where they have a decade-long tenure of really focusing on poverty alleviation and income inequality through the use of a learning agenda. They care deeply about evaluation and research and ensuring that the investments that they make for New York City residents are having the most important impact that they can. And that work has really borne fruit nationally as the programs that they've developed locally get spread to other jurisdictions. But the truth is that, at the local level, this has not yet become a mainstream work of an activity stream for local governments and for states as well. So you as federal partners who are really leading the way set a really important example, I think, for folks everywhere. Which leads me to my next point around stakeholder engagement. And as you think about stakeholder engagement, all of you representing federal agencies and you on the stage, I know some of you already are engaging with your state and local government representatives, but I would encourage all of you to do that. The answers that you are looking for, the questions that you are asking are really relevant to them as well and can help answer other questions that they have. It's a dirty little secret that in state and local government, they're investing even fewer dollars in research and evaluation than even at the federal government level. And I know we're always pushing to invest more to better understand what we're doing. And so really having those conversations on the front end to realize, how can we maximize the impact of the learning that we're doing here to really widen that impact to other levels of government, I think is extremely valuable. And I commend all of you who are doing that. Another point that I just want to lift up from this conversation that was also in this wonderful document that was mentioned earlier today about engaging stakeholders in learning agendas is that the process of developing the learning agenda can be as important as the document itself, right? So understanding what is the evidence, what are the gaps in evidence knowledge, how can we use this evidence really brings meaning to this work, which is, I think, one of the points that you were making, Diana. This is not a compliance exercise. It should not be a compliance exercise. It's really meant to bring meaning to all of our work. And it helps build a culture of evidence, which was discussed as well. And really, also, the points that you all were making about the fear of using data and evidence and the language around using rigorous evaluation and research methodology is very real, and I can say is very much reflected in state and local government as well. There is a fear that research oftentimes is used to cut programs, to eliminate funding. It's also used as a back-end way. Somebody's already made the decision and now they're trying to find the evidence so that they can justify the decisions that are being made. And those fears are real, they're legitimate, and I think the way we talk about this work and really thinking about the question, this is a learning exercise, what are the questions that you have that we can help you answer, I think it's a really important conversation that you guys were lifting up in your conversation and with the audience as well. So I just want to end by saying that if you're interested in going deeper on all of this work, Results for America has a book, Moneyball for Government. Today is a free download day for the book. There are some copies of it in the back. You can, drink a nice glass of Kool-Aid of evidence-based policymaking by reading that book. And it really, I think, what it does so nicely is really highlight that this is a bipartisan issue. Just effectively investing our resources, our public resources, the best way that we can benefits all of us. So thank you all so much. We really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of the event.